Go.
All right, we're going to read a primary source, History of U.S. Independence. A note about primary sources. Primary sources are newspaper articles, for photographs, speeches, or other documents that were created during an event. They are a great way to see how people spoke and felt during that time. You'll find primary sources from events that led to U.S. independence throughout this book. Within the text, primary source quotations are colored red and set in italic type. Land of the free. The Star-Spangled Banner declares the United States to be the land of the free, but it took years of struggle and staggering losses to achieve that freedom. In the 1600s and 1700s, many of the people who came to America were British subjects. They lived in British colonies and were officially under King George III's rule. For years, the British government left the colonists alone, allowing them to make their own laws. While not independent, the people felt free. By the middle of the 1700s, colonists found themselves involved in a war between France and Great Britain. The two sides battled over territories in North America. Colonists fought alongside British troops. American Indians joined with the French. This conflict became known as the French and Indian War of 1754 to 1763. When the war ended, France lost all its territory on mainland North America, but Great Britain worried that Indians would continue fighting. The British government refused to let colonists move to the new areas and left 10,000 troops in the colonies. This decision was the first of many that colonists would protest after the war. Those protests would eventually build into a fight for free and independent states, absolved from the alliances to the British Crown, as the Declaration of Independence ultimately proclaimed. Absolve is to pardon something or free the person from blame. Alliance is loyal support for someone or something. A large number of American Indians joined the French during the French and Indian War. They hoped the French would help protect their lands. High cost of victory. Fighting the French and Indian War left Great Britain with an enormous debt. Because the victory benefited the colonists, Parliament believed colonists should help pay for it. In March 1765, lawmakers in Great Britain passed the Stamp Act to raise money. The act said that starting in November, colonists had to buy British tax stamps for many paper products printed in America. The colonists were shocked. They were used to electing representatives to colonial governments who collected any necessary taxes. Colonists did not elect any representatives to the British Parliament. Colonists protest the Stamp Act by burning tax stamps in the street. Parliament, a group of people who make laws and run the government in some countries. Connecticut Governor Thomas Fitch wrote this pamphlet in 1764, protesting the new taxes, reasons why the British colonies in America should not be charged with internal taxes by authority of Parliament, humbly offered for consideration in behalf of the colony of Connecticut. Printed by B. Meckham, MDD. That's a lot of things. It suddenly became obvious that colonists had no voice in the government that ruled them. Connecticut's colony governor, Thomas Fitch, wrote, "The power lately exercised by Parliament of imposing taxes on the colonies without their consent is inconsistent with the principles and spirit of the British Constitution and an infringement on the essential liberties of the colonies." But Parliament didn't understand why colonists were fighting the tax. British lawmaker Soam Jenyns found the American arguments filled with insolence equal to their absurdity. Insolence, insulting and outspoken behavior. No, you cannot have lunch. It is not even 10. Protests begin. The Stamp Act, you can have a banana, apple, orange, carrots. The Stamp Act quickly divided colonists. British loyalists argued that Parliament controlled them and could tax them. Patriot merchants refused to buy or sell British goods. As tempers flared, the Massachusetts legislature called the colonists to discuss the Stamp Act. In October 1765, 28 delegates from 9 colonies met in New York at the Stamp Act Congress. After much debate, the delegates agreed that His Majesty's subjects in those colonies owe the same allegiance to the Crown of Great Britain that is owing from his subjects born within the realm. However, the delegates also decided that because there were no representatives elected to Parliament from the colonies, Parliament could not tax them without their agreement. It is inseparably essential to the freedom of a people that no taxes be imposed on them, but with their own consent, given personally or by their representatives. Estimated division of the colonial population during the Revolutionary War. The blue is loyalists supporting Great Britain. The red is patriots protested Great Britain. And the green is undecided. Leaders in Great Britain disagreed. They believed that since Britain owned the colonies, Parliament could do whatever it wanted there. George Grenville, Britain's former prime minister, claimed Great Britain protects America. America is bound to yield obedience. When the Stamp Act went into effect in November, many colonists protested and refused to pay it. By March 1766, Parliament realized it couldn't collect the tax. It repealed the Stamp Act. The repeal was the first major victory for the colonists. Critical thinking. Compare the quotations from Grenville and Jennings, I don't know how to say his name, Jennings, with those from Fitch and the Stamp Act Congress. What do they reflect about how Parliament viewed the colonists and how the colonists viewed themselves? Loyalist, a colonist who was loyal to Great Britain. A patriot, a person who sided with the colonies. Repeal, to officially cancel something such as a law. Long after the Revolutionary War, artists created images showing the colonists rebelling against Britain. Trouble brews in Boston. After the Stamp Act, Parliament was even more determined to show its power in America. 1766 Declaratory Act announced Parliament's right to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Parliament could pass whatever laws it thought right. A year later, it did just that with the Townshend Acts. This law put new taxes on glass, paint, oil, paper, and tea. The Townshend Acts revived the colonists' anger. Again, patriots boycotted British goods. Some patriots even bullied those who ignored the boycott. Britain worried that it was losing control. Parliament sent more troops to the colonies to enforce the laws. Isabel, no sister. Not okay.
Isabel, no sister.
The situation grew more tense every day. The greatest friction was in Boston, where 4,000 troops occupied the town. On the night of March 5th, 1770, a rowdy group of colonists shouted insults at a soldier. Nasty words were followed by snowballs. A mob began to grow, swelling with violence. Captain Thomas Preston raced to the scene with more British soldiers. He later wrote about the scene. The mob still increased and were more outrageous, striking their clubs one against another, calling out, "Come on, you rascals, you bloody backs, you lobster scoundrels. Fire if you dare." Boycott. To refuse to take part in something as a way of making a protest. The soldiers fired into the crowd. By the time the riot ended, 5 colonists were dead. Bostonian John Rowe wrote about the event in his diary. A quarrel between the soldiers and inhabitants. A party of the 29th, under the command of Captain Preston, fired on the people. The inhabitants are greatly enraged, and not without reason. I wonder how many died.
Probably 12,000.
They have blood coming out of these people in the pictures, so yeah. All right. Patriot Paul Revere engraved this image of the events in Boston and released it to colonists on about March 28, 1770. His picture showed soldiers firing on quiet citizens. Critical thinking. Compare Paul Revere's engraving of the Boston Massacre with Preston's account of the event. How do the two accounts differ? Why do you think they are different? Because one's controlled by the government and one is not.
Which one's government?
The one that said that the people were violent and using their clubs to hit people and yelling things and stuff, that people were protesting.
What's that mean?
They didn't want to participate in taxes being forced upon them without their consent.
Yeah, I think that's illegal.
It's legal now to protest, peacefully protest. All right, I think I read everything on this page. All right, tea time.
Yeah.
After what became known as the Boston Massacre, the troops left Boston. So that last bit, this one was the Boston Massacre, where the troops just decided to fire upon the people. After what became known as the Boston Massacre, the troops left Boston. A few years of relative peace followed. Because of the colonists' resistance, Parliament repealed the Townshend Acts. The only tax that remained was a tax on tea. But by 1773, the East India Tea Company was in serious financial trouble. The company paid thousands of pounds to the British government every year. If the company failed, the government would lose a great deal of money. To save the company, Parliament passed the Tea Act. This law allowed the company to sell tea without charging the tax. Colonial tea merchants grew angry because they still had to pay tax on other teas. They believed Parliament was favoring the East India Tea Company. Citizens in Plymouth, Massachusetts, published editorials attacking the act as dangerous to the commerce of this country. Further, they pledged to aid and support all our brethren in their opposition to this and every violation of our rights. Other Plymouth citizens feared the consequences of fighting against the act. They published their opinions opposing any actions that might introduce anarchy, confusion, and disorder into the state. Pound, the unit of money in the United Kingdom. Wow. In Boston, 3 East India Tea Company ships docked in the harbor. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of patriots sneaked onto the ships. We cared no more for our lives than 3 straws, and determined to throw the tea overboard, recalled Patriot David Kennerson. In 3 hours, they dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. Patriots were overjoyed at the act of rebellion. This is the grandest event which has ever yet happened since the controversy with Britain opened, wrote John Adams. Intolerable acts. King George and Parliament were furious about the Boston Tea Party. Parliament closed Boston Harbor and issued harsh new laws. The British military commander in America became governor of Massachusetts. Colonists could no longer elect local officials. British troops returned and were allowed to live in private homes without the owner's permission. Parliament called these laws the Coercive Acts. Colonists called them the Intolerable Acts. Can you imagine some soldier just showing up and saying, I'm allowed to live here, get out? And they take all your food, live in your house.
Our
It's like-
toys?
I mean, the soldiers won't want your toys, but...
Yay. They would want our chicken.
In September 1774, 55 delegates met in Philadelphia to try to settle the situation. Their purpose was to proclaim to Britain their unhappiness with the current laws. Their second, more difficult job was to define their relationship with Britain. There was great disagreement. James Galloway of Pennsylvania argued that the colonies should make amends and take such ground as shall firmly unite us under one system of policy and make us one people. Amends, to make up for a mistake. Benjamin Franklin, a diplomat from Pennsylvania.
Benjamin?
Yes.
That's my friend's name.
Pennsylvania, wrote to Galloway. Franklin was starting to think the colonies should be their own nation. Guys. When I considered the extreme corruption in this old, rotten state and the glorious public virtue so predominant in our rising country, I cannot but apprehend more mischief than benefit from a closer union. On October 14th, the delegates of the First Continental Congress wrote to Parliament. They asked for a repeal of the laws they believed violated their rights. Then they shut off all trade with Britain. In this reproduction of a drawing by H.A. Ogden, delegates leave Carpenter's Hall after a session of the First Continental Congress. This right here, passed by Parliament on March 31st, 1774, the Boston Port Bill closed Boston Harbor until colonists paid for the destroyed tea. Fighting begins. The king and Parliament did not agree to the Congress's proposal. Many colonists were starting to believe the only solution was to become entirely free of Britain. They began preparing for war. Militia companies formed. Colonists stockpiled ammunition. Parliament declared the colonies in a state of rebellion. People took sides with ever-growing passion. In March 1775, Patriot Patrick Henry declared, "I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty, or give me death." Militia, a group of volunteer citizens who serve as soldiers in emergencies. Others agreed with loyalist supporter Samuel Seabury. "If I must be enslaved, let it be by a king at least, and not by a parcel of upstart, lawless committeemen." On April 18, 1775, patriots learned the British planned to march that night to Lexington, Massachusetts. They had two missions. The first was to arrest Patriot leader John Hancock and Sam Adams. The second was to destroy a stockpile of ammunition in Concord. Paul Revere and William Dawes alerted Hancock, Adams, and the militia. When the British arrived the next day, about 70 Minutemen were waiting, and so the war began. Nobody knows who fired first. When the fighting was over, 8 Minutemen were dead. The British had won the battle. But as they marched back to Boston, more colonial militia suddenly swarmed them. On our leaving Concord to return to Boston, they began to fire on us from behind the walls, ditches, and trees, reported a British leader. The colonists attacked fiercely, killing and wounding more than 100 British soldiers. After the battles at Lexington and Concord, and the Massachusetts Provincial Congress had Isaiah Thomas print this pamphlet as an official account of the battles. That's this right here. These are actual copies, pictures of the documents. Minutemen, dressed in their regular clothes, stood up to the highly trained British Army during the Battle of Lexington. I don't know why they were called Minutemen.
Maybe they sit there for a minute.
Battles with weapons and words. As news of the battle spread, patriots rushed to enlist in militias. Loyalists joined with the British troops. On May 10th, 1775, the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia to discuss how to handle the British military threat. The same day, American rebels captured the British-held Fort Ticonderoga in New York. The capture surprised even the Continental Congress. Delegates voted to form the Continental Army. They appointed George Washington to be the Army's commander-in-chief. Despite ongoing battles, many colonists still resisted war with Britain. On July 5th, 1775, Congress tried again to peacefully resolve the problems. It sent King George the olive branch petition. In it, delegates wrote, "We not only desire the former harmony between her, Great Britain, and these colonies may be restored, but that a concord may be established between them." King George refused to read it. He declared the colonists were misled by dangerous and ill-designed men, and forgetting the allegiance which they owe to the power that has protected and supported them, he vowed to convict anyone fighting against Great Britain of treason. Printed in 1775, this map of the British battle plan was drawn by an officer at the Battle of Bunker Hill. Below the map appears a letter written by British General John Bergen to his nephew. The letter describes why the general felt it was absolutely necessary to become masters of these heights. Treason, the act of betraying one's country. Chill out, bro. Shh. I'm still reading. Almost done. Declaring independence. Even before receiving King George's reply, Congress knew there was little hope for the olive branch petition. The delegates continued to debate. Many were against independence, simply wanting fair representation in Parliament. When King George refused to read their petition, however, talk of independence grew louder. In January 1776, Thomas Paine published his pamphlet, Common Sense. "I challenge the warmest advocate for reconciliation to show a single advantage that this continent can reap by being connected with Great Britain. We are already greater than the king wishes us to be, and will he not hereafter endeavor to make us less?" The title page to Paine's Common Sense. After the events of the past year, Paine's arguments made sense to many colonists, but others worried that creating a new government could be worse than being under the king. "We have long flourished under our charter government," wrote clergyman William Smith. What may be the consequences of another form we cannot pronounce with clarity. But this we know, that it is a road we have not traveled, and may be worse than it is described. Critical thinking. Compare Paine's argument for independence with Smith's argument to stay loyal to Great Britain. What action words does each person use to persuade others? How do these words support their opinions? This is King George the third. Through the first half of 1776, battles raged in the colonies. At the Continental Congress on June 7th, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia asked delegates to vote on independence. He said, "These united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved." 7 delegates supported Lee's motion. Others worried that such a succession would weaken us. Congress decided delegates should write to their colonies' legislatures for instructions. They would wait until July 1st to hold a vote. While they waited, a committee formed to write an explanation of why the colonists had the right to declare independence. Committee members chose Thomas Jefferson to write the first draft. On July 2nd, Congress voted in favor of independence. On July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was read. All men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. By signing the Declaration, the delegates officially declared independence and became British traitors. If America lost the war, they could be hung for treason. This reproduction of a painting by Clyde Deland that was printed in Harper's Weekly in 1897 shows Thomas Jefferson reading a rough draft of the Declaration to Benjamin Franklin. Wow. This is a painting. That is intensely good. Wow. After crowds in New York City heard the reading of the Declaration of Independence, they pulled down a statue of King George III. The statue was melted down and the metal was molded into bullets for Patriot guns. How cool. Battles of the Revolution. Please stop. That's annoying. Please stop. Looks like you got lots of peanut butter on my floor. You need to come clean up. Battles of the Revolution. Later that summer, Washington's army was camped on Long Island, New York. The British forced the army off Long Island into Manhattan, through New Jersey, and across the Delaware River. The loss of New York made people wonder if Washington was the right person to lead the fight. Many soldiers left the army. Very little ammunition remained. The struggle seemed hopeless, but Washington rallied. On a bitterly cold Christmas night, patriots surprised the British by crossing the frozen Delaware River and defeating them in Trenton, New Jersey. Now people called Washington a hero. An even greater turning point in the Revolution came when the American victory at Saratoga, New York, in October 1777. The British Army lost more than 3/4 of its forces. After the battle, British General Burgoyne described it in a letter to his niece. He had been under perpetual fire, 16 almost sleepless nights without change of clothes or other covering than the sky. I have been with my army within the jaws of famine, my nearest friends killed round me. Major battles of the Revolution. It says the city, shows the rivers, this darker color is the colonies. British victories are little red suns, American victories are little blue suns. The Battle of Saratoga also convinced France that the colonists could win against Great Britain. Still angry about their loss in the French and Indian War, France agreed to help the colonies. Many historians believe the colonists might not have won the war if France had not sent help. Watch out, there's peanut butter.
No,
all
that's not
over the
peanut
floor.
butter, that's orange.
It looks like peanut butter.
That's orange.
Wins and losses. After the victory at Saratoga, Washington settled his army for the winter in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. It was a terrible winter. Soldiers built huts from mud and logs or lived in tents. They didn't have enough food or clothing. Some were forced to go barefoot, and bloody footprints covered the snow. More than 2,000 soldiers died. Washington wrote to his friends and fellow soldier George Clinton for help. For some days past, there has been little less than a famine in camp. A part of the army has been a week without any kind of flesh meat, and the rest for 3 or 4 days. If you can devise any means to produce a quantity of cattle for the use of this army, you will render a most essential service to the common cause. Despite the horrible conditions, the soldiers trained through the winter, they emerged a stronger army. Over the next few years, they fought numerous battles. In some, they claimed victory. In others, the British defeated them. In October 1781, Washington secretly brought his troops to Yorktown, Virginia. The British had seized the city, but the Patriots trapped and tricked them. They arrived in the dark of night and on October 9th began firing. After several days, the British were forced to surrender. The war was not over, but the British army was much weaker. Following this defeat, Parliament began to discuss possible terms of a peace treaty. It grew clear to both sides that the revolution was ending and the Americans had won. The camp of the American army at Valley Forge, February 1778. Created in 1910 by artist Edwin Austin Abbey. Created by artist Sidney E. King, this image shows Washington's headquarters during the siege of Yorktown. Freedom. Throughout the war, The Continental Congress debated how to form a new government. On November 15, 1777, Congress adopted the Articles of Confederation. Colonies agreed to follow these laws and become one nation. Article 1 named this new country, "The style of this confederacy shall be the United States of America." When news came of the defeat of Yorktown, King George wanted to continue fighting. "It is all over," the British Prime Minister declared on November 30th, 1782. Great Britain signed a preliminary agreement recognizing the independent United States. The official peace treaty was signed September 3rd, 1783. American and British representatives met in Paris, France. The Treaty of Paris officially declared, "His Britannic Majesty acknowledges the said United States to be free, sovereign, and independent states." After nearly 20 years of debate and struggle, Americans had formed a new country. The colonists did more, however, than win freedom for themselves. The nation they fought to form became one of the world's most powerful leaders. The effects of the American Revolution reached far beyond America and changed the world. In 1789, delegates met to discuss the Articles of Confederation. They realized those rules weren't as powerful as they needed to be, so they again debated and developed the U.S. Constitution we know today. The first page of the Articles of Constitution. This reproduction of a printing by C. Seller depicts the signing of the preliminary treaty in 1782. All right, buddy, that was it.
I want to show the camera something real quick.
Oh, he wants to blow some bubbles. Oh, that bubble didn't make it. Okay, the camera can't see you at all. It's okay. Bye, y'all.
I didn't hit it.
Okay, hit it now then.